how does a nation simultaneously become the undisputed factory of the world, building the most colossal industrial base in human history while its working age population permanently collapses?
Well, it sounds like a mathematical impossibility, frankly. I mean,
Yeah.
if your entire economic engine relies on an endless supply of cheap labor and that labor suddenly uh, vanishes.
Right, you would expect stagnation or like at least a massive disruptive crash.
Exactly.
But when you actually look at the macroeconomic data, that isn't what happens at all. Instead, you see something much more complex. You see an economy that realizes the cheap fuel is running out, and instead of stopping, it completely rebuilds its own engine while speeding down the highway at 80 miles an hour.
Which is a terrifying but incredibly accurate analogy.
Yeah. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping into a sweeping, entirely data-driven narrative of a single nation's profound structural transformation.
And we're basing this analysis on this really fascinating 15-slide executive presentation. It's titled Multidimensional Data Insights on China's Socioeconomic and Environmental Transition, 1960 to 2024.
Which is quite a mouthful.
It is, yeah. But the subtitle really captures the essence of what we're looking at today. It's the path evolution from scale expansion to high-quality development.
And our mission for this deep dive is to act as a shortcut for you, the listener. We want to help you truly understand how an entire economy pivots from raw scale and massive size to high-quality, sustainable development.
Right, without getting bogged down.
Exactly. We are going to avoid all the external noise, ignore the geopolitical headlines, and look strictly at the numbers. Because the numbers tell a story that is, honestly, it's like a macroeconomic thriller.
It really is. And the numbers we have are just incredibly comprehensive. I mean, we are analyzing a dense stack of raw data sets spanning over 6 decades.
6 decades? That's a lot of data.
Millions of data points. We are covering demographic shifts, economic growth, human capital development, health outcomes, environmental metrics. It is an empirical analysis of a society moving from this agrarian baseline in the 1960s to a highly complex digital and urbanized reality today.
So I want to start with that baseline, actually, because if you don't understand the starting line, the rest of the data just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you need the context.
Right. In the 1960s, we are looking at a fundamentally agrarian society, extremely low income, massive poverty, and an economic model that was essentially just localized subsistence farming. But over the following decades, a specific dynamic took hold that changed the global economy forever. So let's unpack this. I'm looking at slide 4 of the presentation. It highlights the 15 to 64-year-old demographic, basically the working age population.
Yes. And for a very long time, the global narrative about this particular economy was entirely focused on its massive, just seemingly inexhaustible labor force.
Right, the whole factory of the world thing.
Exactly. And the data from the 1980s, the 90s, and into the 2000s reflects exactly that. Historically, this working-age demographic climbed steadily, eventually hitting this incredible historic peak where 72.6% of the entire population was in that 15 to 64 age bracket.
Just pause and think about that number for a second. Nearly 3/4 of your entire population is of working age.
It is an enormous concentration of potential labor. In economics, we actually call this the demographic dividend.
Demographic dividend. Okay, define that.
So demographic dividend occurs when the proportion of working people in the total population is abnormally high, because it means you have this massive army of producers supporting a relatively small number of dependents, meaning children and the elderly.
Okay, so lots of workers, very few people sitting on the sidelines.
Right. And when you combine that massive labor pool with market reforms and global integration, you get an explosive period of industrialization.
Because you can just throw bodies at any production problem, right? Like, you need to build the world's consumer goods. Boom. You have hundreds of millions of people migrating from rural villages to coastal manufacturing hubs.
And they're willing to work for wages that severely undercut the rest of the world.
It's what allowed them to become that factory. But here is the paradox I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive. The data shows that the era of the endless labor pool is definitively ending.
It is over.
Yeah. That smooth climbing curve of working age adults has crested. It is now steadily drooping downward, and it's currently sitting at about 69.32%.
And, 69.32% might still sound pretty high to a layperson.
It does sound high.
But in macroeconomics, the absolute number is often less important than the trajectory. And the trajectory is pointing permanently downward. The traditional labor-intensive expansion model where you achieve GDP growth simply by building more low-skill factories and filling them with young workers is now mathematically impossible to sustain.
Because the people just aren't there.
You simply do not have the raw human numbers entering the workforce to replace the people who are retiring.
Which brings us to slide 3, and a metric that frankly looks a little terrifying if you're an economic planner. While that working age line is drooping downward, there's another line on the chart crossing its path, just shooting sharply upward, and that's the old age dependency ratio.
Yeah, the old age dependency ratio essentially measures the pressure on the productive part of the population. It compares the number of people over 65 to the number of people of working age.
Right.
So for a very long time, this ratio hovered at an incredibly low, stable baseline, around 7.12%.
Meaning what exactly in terms of actual people?
It means for every one elderly person, you had roughly 14 working-age adults supporting the broader economy and the tax base.
14 workers to 1 retiree, that's a huge safety net. But the recent data shows a sharp exponential acceleration. It hasn't just crept up, it has completely broken right through the 20% threshold, hitting 21.15% in the most recent data.
Exactly. And the presentation explicitly circles this acceleration point with a dashed line. Going from 7% to over 21% means that instead of 14 workers supporting 1 retiree, you now have fewer than 5.
Okay, hold on. I have to push back a little here. A 21% old age dependency ratio is a massive jump for them, sure. But if we look at other developed nations, say Japan or Italy or Germany, their dependency ratios are much higher, aren't they? I mean, Japan is pushing 50%.
Oh, absolutely.
So why is 21.15% treated in this specific data set as such a critical, flashing red light structural crisis?
That is a fantastic point, and it really comes down to a concept economists call getting old before getting rich.
Getting old before getting rich. Interesting.
Yeah. When Japan or Germany saw their old age dependency ratios cross the 20 or 30% mark,
Yeah.
they were already highly advanced, high-income economies.
They already had the money in the bank.
Exactly. They had already built their massive sovereign wealth funds, their universal healthcare systems were fully funded and operational, and their per capita GDP was among the highest in the entire world. They had the wealth to absorb the shock of an aging population.
Ah. But in this case, the demographic shift is happening while the country is still technically transitioning out of middle income status?
Precisely. The speed of the aging is vastly outpacing the accumulation of per capita wealth. When your dependency ratio triples in just a few decades, the Social Security and healthcare systems face this structural, undeniable pressure before they have even fully matured.
Wow.
Every single worker now carries a significantly heavier burden to support the non-working elderly population. The silver economy demand for healthcare and elder care just explodes, but you don't necessarily have the massive tax base of a fully developed Western nation to easily pay for it all.
So, okay, let's look at the mechanics of this. If your entire growth miracle was based on having 1 billion people willing to do labor-intensive work, and suddenly the labor pool shrinks, and a massive chunk of your population now needs pensions and medical care, how do you keep the economy from collapsing? If you can't rely on the quantity of labor anymore, what is the mechanical fix?
Well, when the sheer quantity of labor shrinks, an economy has to pivot fundamentally to the productivity of labor.
Productivity, meaning squeezing more juice out of the same orange.
Basically, yeah. If you have fewer workers, each remaining worker must produce vastly more value. And how do you multiply the productivity of a single human being?
I'm guessing you give them better tools.
You give them vastly better tools. You need physical capital. You need machines, automated factories, advanced infrastructure, high-speed logistics networks.
But building all of those advanced tools, the automation, the high-speed rail, the massive power grids, that requires an astronomical amount of money. Which brings us to the next massive piece of the puzzle in this data set. We have to look at wealth and savings, specifically slide 5 and slide 6.
Right. Slide 5 tracks per capita GDP, and it uses a very specific metric.
Yeah.
Constant 2015 US dollars.
Okay, let's clarify that for you, the listener. When economists look at historical growth over, say, 60 years, looking at raw, Nominal dollars is basically useless because of inflation.
Completely useless.
Right, because $100 in 1960 bought a lot more than $100 today. So using constant 2015 US dollars strips out the illusion of inflation. It pegs everything to the purchasing power of the year 2015.
It gives us a true apples-to-apples measure of how much the standard of living actually increased.
And when you look at that inflation-adjusted chart on slide 5,
Right.
you aren't looking at a steady 45-degree angle line. You are looking at a logarithmic leap.
It really is staggering.
Yeah.
From the 1960s, where the figure was incredibly low, representing that agrarian society with minimal industrial output, to today, where it has vaulted over critical middle-income thresholds. It is an exponential curve that represents a historic accumulation of real wealth in a highly compressed time frame.
But, the GDP growth alone isn't the craziest part of this section. For me, it's the savings rate. I'm looking at slide 6, which tracks gross domestic savings as a percentage of GDP. The historical data shows it consistently staying above 40% and at times pushing near 50%.
Yeah.
Let me just stop right there, because from a Western macroeconomic perspective, a 50% savings rate sounds insane.
It is an extraordinarily high figure. I mean, for context, in many Western developed economies, the national savings rate might hover around 15 to 20%.
Exactly. So I need you to explain the mechanics of this, because it feels totally counterintuitive. We are usually taught that consumer spending is what drives the economy. People buy things, companies make things, jobs are created.
The standard Keynesian model, yeah.
Right. So if an entire nation is hoarding half of its income, saving 50% of the GDP, doesn't that mean domestic consumption is incredibly weak? How did the economy grow so fast if nobody was buying anything?
You've hit on the central tension of their historical growth model. You are absolutely correct that a 50% savings rate suppresses domestic consumption. People were not going to the mall, buying cars, or dining out at the rates you would see in a consumption-led economy like the U.S.
So they were just hoarding cash.
But we have to ask why the savings rate was so high and where that money actually went.
Okay, let's break that down. First, why was it so high? Was it just like a cultural predisposition to thriftiness, Asian values, that sort of thing?
Culture plays a small role, sure, but the primary driver was systemic. Economists call it precautionary savings.
Precautionary. It's like saving for a rainy day.
A very rainy day. During the massive economic reforms of the 80s and 90s, the old system where the state enterprise guaranteed your housing, your health care, and your pension from cradle to grave, that system, was largely dismantled to create a more competitive market economy.
Ah, the so-called iron rice bowl was broken?
Yes, exactly. And when the state suddenly stops guaranteeing your medical care and your retirement, and you don't yet have a modern, mature commercial insurance market, what do you do as a household?
You save every single penny you can. Because if someone gets sick or if you need to pay for your child's education, you are entirely on your own.
Exactly. So households amass these massive savings out of pure necessity. But, and this is the crucial mechanism, those savings didn't just sit under mattresses, they were deposited into the state-owned banking system. And the banking system engaged in a policy known as financial repression.
Financial repression, that sounds ominous. What does that mean in actual practice?
It essentially means the state regulates interest rates to keep deposit rates artificially low. So families were putting all their money into banks because they had to, but they were earning very little interest on it.
Because they had literally nowhere else to put it. There wasn't a robust stock market or alternative investment vehicles for the average citizen back then.
Right. So the state banks now hold this colossal pool of incredibly cheap capital. What do they do with it? They lend it out at artificially low interest rates to state-owned enterprises and local governments.
Ah. Okay, so they take the household savings and they use it to build the country.
Exactly. This is the capital wellspring that financed the heavy industrialization.
Yeah.
It's what paid for the world's largest high-speed rail network, the modernization of the power grids, the construction of sprawling megacities, ports, and highways.
So they basically built the future on the backs of their citizens' delayed consumption.
You cannot build physical infrastructure on that unprecedented scale without an equally unprecedented pool of domestic capital to borrow against. The high savings rate, the delayed gratification of the entire population was the absolute prerequisite for the economic leap.
So coming back to my earlier comment about how to make a shrinking workforce more productive, this is the answer. You use the 50% savings rate to build a world-class physical environment.
Yes.
A factory worker with a hand tool in a dirt floor workshop is only so productive. But a factory worker operating a multi-million-dollar automated stamping press, powered by a brand new electrical grid, and shipping goods on a high-speed rail line to a deep-water port. That worker's productivity is magnified 100-fold.
Precisely. The data in slide 6 showing the domestic savings rate is the hidden engine behind the infrastructure cityscape we see today. They substituted capital for labor.
But there is a hard limit to that strategy, right? I mean, you can build the most advanced automated factory in the world, but if your workforce only has an 8th-grade education, they can't program the robotics.
No, they can't.
They can't design the next generation of semiconductors, which means physical capital alone isn't enough to escape the middle-income trap. You need human capital.
And that transition from physical capital to human capital is arguably the most critical pivot mapped in this entire dataset. If the demographic dividend, the raw quantity of labor, is permanently disappearing, it must be replaced by what economists call a talent dividend.
Talent dividend, I like that.
And we see this vividly in slide 7, which charts the gross enrollment rate in tertiary education.
Tertiary education meaning universities, vocational colleges, advanced technical institutes.
Correct. If you look at the historical baseline for this economy on the chart, the tertiary enrollment rate was less than 1%.
Less than 1%. So higher education was an absolute elite privilege, like a fraction of the population.
It was reserved for the absolute top tier of academic performers, usually concentrated in a few major urban centers. But look at the data trend over the decades. It doesn't just grow linearly, it explodes. The most recent data point shows a staggering 76.7% gross enrollment rate.
That is a fundamental rewiring of a society. Going from less than 1% to over 76% means you have transitioned from elite education, skipped right past mass education, and moved straight into the universal popularization of higher learning.
Yes.
But how do you mechanically achieve that? You can't just wave a wand and declare that everyone goes to college. You need professors, campuses, laboratories. How did they scale the educational infrastructure so violently fast?
It required a massive, coordinated state mobilization, mostly starting in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The government enacted a policy explicitly designed to expand university enrollment. They aggressively merged smaller, specialized institutions into massive, comprehensive universities to create economies of scale.
Oh, so they consolidated.
Consolidating resources, yes.
Yeah.
And they poured those state savings we just talked about into building sprawling new university cities on the outskirts of major metropolises. And crucially, they heavily incentivized the pursuit of STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
So the economy essentially traded scale for skill. To sustain growth in a high-tech, modern global economy, you don't need 50 million people to assemble plastic toys. You need 5 million engineers to design semiconductor architectures, optimize AI algorithms, and develop advanced materials.
Yes, and by pushing the tertiary enrollment to 76.7%, they have effectively constructed the largest single pipeline of engineers and research scientists in the world.
But looking at this data set, the higher education explosion is really only half the story when it comes to human capital. Because to get to university, you first have to get through primary and secondary school.
Right.
And slide 8 tells a story about foundational education that is, frankly, one of the most incredible societal shifts in the entire presentation. We are looking at a dumbbell plot of the Gender Parity Index, or GPI.
The Gender Parity Index is a critical metric used by the World Bank and other institutions to measure the ratio of girls to boys enrolled in school. A score of 1.0 means perfect statistical equality. Anything below 1.0 indicates that girls are disproportionately excluded from the educational system.
And looking at the historical data, the GPI was sitting way down, around 0.2.
Yeah.
That is a brutal statistic. It means for every 10 boys getting an education, only 2 girls were in the classroom.
It was. The gender inequality was severe, deeply rooted in historical, agrarian, patriarchal norms, where male children were prioritized for whatever limited resources a family had.
Right, because if you can only afford to send one kid to school.
In an agrarian subsistence economy, physical strength is premium, and cultural norms often dictate that daughters marry into other families, meaning an investment in a daughter's education was historically viewed as a loss for the natal family. That is the grim economic calculus that produced a 0.2 GPI.
Wow. But then you follow the data over the decades on this plot. It moves steadily toward the center, crossing the 1.0 baseline, and actually stabilizing just above it, which means total parity with a slight statistical lean toward females currently completing primary and secondary education. So beyond the obvious moral and human rights victory of this shift, I want to talk about the raw economic mechanics. What does moving from point 2 to 1.0 actually do to a macroeconomy?
Well, from an economic perspective, marginalizing half of your population is a catastrophic waste of human capital. It is like trying to fly a plane with one engine intentionally turned off.
Right.
By closing that gender gap in primary and secondary education, the society effectively liberated the female workforce.
Because an educated woman isn't just staying in the rural village, she's migrating to the city, taking a factory job, then maybe a service job, then a white-collar job.
Exactly. Educating women and integrating them fully into the modern urban economy is universally recognized by development economists as one of the most powerful productivity multipliers in history. First, it literally doubles your available talent pool.
Yeah.
You now have twice as many potential researchers, doctors, and engineers.
Right.
Second, it fundamentally alters household economics. You move from single-income agrarian households to dual-income urban households, which massively increases the tax base and potential domestic consumption.
And doesn't it also tie directly back to our very first topic, the demographics?
Oh yes, it is a perfect feedback loop. As female education and workforce participation rise, birth rates naturally decline. Women delay marriage and childbirth to pursue education and careers.
Which accelerates the demographic transition we saw in slide 4, the shrinking working age population.
Exactly. So the state must rely on the increased productivity and brain power of those educated women because the sheer volume of new workers is dropping, partially because women are now educated.
It's incredible how every single data point in this slide deck is intricately linked. You fix the education gap, which boosts productivity, but it also lowers the birth rate, which shrinks the future workforce, which forces you to invest even more in education to make the remaining workers even smarter. It's a continuous self-reinforcing cycle.
It is the definition of a structural metamorphosis. But, upgrading the mind, building this hyper-educated, gender-equal workforce is only effective if that workforce is physically capable of participating in the economy.
Right. Productivity requires physical help and longevity. If you have fewer workers and you've spent massive amounts of capital educating them to a tertiary level, you cannot afford for them to be sidelined by preventable diseases. You certainly can't afford to lose them entirely.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the health data in slide 9 and 10.
Slide 9 presents a scatter plot tracking public health outcomes, and the most prominent metric highlighted is the infant mortality rate.
And the trajectory on this chart is just a cliff edge drop. It plummets from incredibly high historical levels down to single digits specifically, under 6 per 1,000 live births. Now, I understand that saving lives is objectively good. We all agree on that.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, out of all the health metrics a macroeconomist could track, life expectancy, cancer survival rates, the sheer number of massive super hospitals built in Tier 1 cities, why is infant mortality specifically treated as such a critical benchmark in this data set?
That is a very perceptive question. Why not track the number of MRI machines, right? Development economists focus heavily on infant mortality because it is the ultimate litmus test for society's invisible infrastructure.
Invisible infrastructure. What do you mean by that?
Think about it this way. You can easily mask a struggling healthcare system by building one gleaming, state-of-the-art flagship hospital in your financial capital. It looks great on camera, and wealthy urbanites get world-class care.
Sure, great PR.
But that one hospital won't significantly move the national infant mortality rate, especially in a country with a vast geography and a massive rural population.
Because the babies dying aren't dying in the financial capital. They are dying in remote mountain villages or underserved agricultural provinces.
Exactly. Infant mortality is mostly driven by preventable factors, waterborne diseases, lack of basic prenatal nutrition, unsanitary birthing conditions, and lack of foundational vaccines. To get a national infant mortality rate down to under 6 per 1,000 across a massive geographically diverse nation, you cannot rely on a few super hospitals. You have to have the invisible grassroots infrastructure working perfectly everywhere.
I see the logic, but isn't relying entirely on local rural clinics for infant mortality incredibly difficult to standardize across a population of over 1 billion people? How do they actually execute that logistically?
It is incredibly difficult, which is why dropping below 6 per 1,000 is such a monumental economic indicator. It proves that the state successfully mobilized a massive, decentralized public health network.
Right.
It means there's reliable electricity in remote areas to maintain the cold chain, the refrigerated supply chain necessary to keep vaccines viable. It means water treatment facilities are actually functioning. It means there are paved roads so an ambulance can actually reach a rural clinic in time. It means there is a standardized system of maternal care education reaching families who, a generation ago, relied entirely on traditional midwives.
Wow. So infant mortality isn't just a medical statistic, it's really a proxy for the entire foundation of state capacity.
It is.
If your infant mortality is low, it proves your roads, your power grid, your water sanitation, and your local governance are actually functioning at the grassroots level.
Precisely. It is the verifiable proof that the wealth generated by that 50% savings rate is actually trickling down to basic human welfare.
Hmm.
And we see the financial reflection of this in slide 10, which tracks healthcare expenditure as a percentage of GDP.
The data here shows the expenditure steadily climbing from roughly 4% to nearly 6% of the total GDP.
Which perfectly aligns with the demographic shift we discussed at the very beginning. As the population ages, and as the old age dependency ratio crosses that 21% threshold, the state must pivot its wealth. The rising GDP share of health spending reflects an economy transitioning away from pure heavy industry expansion, pouring concrete for highways and moving toward human welfare, medical research, and building robust social safety nets.
Because you have to protect the highly educated human capital you just spent decades building. You can't let a level 50 engineer, to use a terrible gaming analogy, drop out of the workforce at age 45 because of a preventable chronic illness.
Exactly. The human being is now the most valuable asset in the economy.
Okay, let's take stock of where we are in this journey because the narrative thread here is incredibly tight. We started with a massive pool of cheap agrarian labor that fueled the factory of the world. But that labor pool peaked and is now shrinking and rapidly aging. To survive, the country saved half its income to build world-class physical infrastructure. Then they educated their entire population, bringing women fully into the fold and securing the physical health of those citizens to maximize their productivity.
Right.
So now you have a nation of highly educated, healthy people backed by massive capital and infrastructure. The next logical question is, what do they actually do all day?
They build and then inhabit an entirely new digital and service-based reality. If we move to slide 11, we see the blueprint of the digital nervous system.
I find technology adoption curves fascinating, and the data set for internet usage here is a flawless S-curve.
It really is textbook.
It rockets from literally 0% in 1990, stays relatively flat for a bit during the early dial-up days, and then goes nearly vertical, hitting over 75% recently.
Yeah.
And the data for mobile cellular subscriptions, it's hit total saturation. Essentially, everybody is connected.
The S-curve in this context is vital because it illustrates the macroeconomic phenomenon of leapfrogging.
Let's really dig into leapfrogging. I think people use that term a lot as a buzzword, but how does an economy systemically skip over decades of technological evolution? What does that actually look like on the ground?
To understand leapfrogging, you have to look at the burden of legacy infrastructure in early industrialized nations. Think about the development of telecommunications and banking in the West.
Okay.
We spent decades and billions of dollars laying copper landline telephone wires to every single house and business. Then we spent decades building physical banking infrastructure, brick-and-mortar bank branches on every corner, massive logistical networks of armored cars, clearinghouses required to process paper checks, and eventually the physical swiping machines and networks for plastic credit cards.
Right, and it takes forever to build all of that. And once you have it, you're deeply invested in it. You have whole industries and regulatory frameworks built around paper checks and plastic cards.
Exactly. That legacy infrastructure becomes a sunk cost that actually slows down the adoption of newer technologies.
Because you don't want to throw away what you just spent $1 trillion building.
Precisely. But an economy that develops later doesn't have that baggage. They look at the copper wire and say, why would we lay millions of miles of copper when we can just build 4G and 5G cellular towers and instantly connect hundreds of millions of people wirelessly?
They bypass the landline era entirely.
And they do the exact same thing with banking. The vast majority of the population historically did not have access to formal credit cards or checkbooks. The society operated almost entirely on physical cash.
Right.
So rather than spending 20 years building a plastic credit card network to transition away from cash, they jumped straight from a cash-based society into ubiquitous mobile network digital payments.
The QR code revolution.
Yes. A street vendor selling fruit doesn't need to rent a credit card terminal. They just print out a QR code on a piece of paper, and a customer scans it with their smartphone. The transaction is settled instantly on a digital ledger. The friction of commerce drops to near zero.
So they go from zero to the most advanced, frictionless system available in a fraction of the time. And this digital explosion completely changes the structure of the economy. If we look at slide 14, the data proves this shift. It tracks the value added of different sectors to the GDP, and it shows that the service sector has officially surpassed the industrial sector.
That is a watershed moment for any developing nation.
Just to clarify value added for a second for the listeners, it means the actual new wealth created by a sector minus the cost of the raw materials used. So if you buy $1 of steel and make a $10 car part, the value added is $9. This data is telling us that the services sector, software, finance, logistics, entertainment, is now creating more new wealth than the factories. The factory is no longer the undisputed king.
And this transition creates a profound macroeconomic shield called internal circulation.
Internal circulation. How so? Because for decades, the story of this economy was external circulation,
Yeah.
right? Making cheap goods and exporting them to the rest of the world. The growth relied entirely on foreign consumers buying their stuff.
Exactly. Export-led growth is a powerful engine, but it leaves you highly vulnerable. If there is a financial crisis in the West or a sudden geopolitical trade war and foreign consumers stop buying your exports, your factories shut down, and your economy crashes, you are at the mercy of external shocks.
Yeah, you don't control your own destiny.
But look at what happens when you combine the S-curve of digital adoption with the rise of the service sector. You have hundreds of millions of newly middle-class, hyper-educated citizens transacting digitally every single day, buying domestic software, using domestic e-commerce, paying for domestic healthcare and education.
They become their own engine. The economy starts to consume what it produces.
Yes, the center of gravity shifts inward. This relies much more on internal consumption and a self-sustaining digital ecosystem. It makes the economy far more resilient.
Because if global trade slows down, a service-based, digitally connected domestic economy can sustain its own momentum.
Exactly. This transition from export-dependent manufacturing to domestic service consumption is the absolute hallmark of escaping the middle-income trap and becoming a mature economy.
Okay, the narrative is incredibly compelling, but I have to stop us here. We spent a long time discussing these incredible triumphs, the wealth accumulation, the rapid education, the plummeting infant mortality, the leapfrogging into a digital service economy.
Right.
But building this colossal machine, pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in record time, came with a devastating atmospheric price tag. And that brings us to the final two slides, 12 and 13, the ultimate cost and the green mandate.
The environmental data in this transition is stark, and the presentation does not shy away from it at all. Slide 12 tracks per capita carbon dioxide, or CO2 emissions.
And the numbers are staggering. Historically, the per capita emissions were around 1.1 tons. Recently, that number has surged to over 9.3 tons per person.
When you industrialize a nation of over 1 billion people at that speed, when you are literally pouring more concrete in a few years than the United States poured in the entire 20th century, the carbon footprint is going to be massive. Powering the factory of the world required burning astronomical amounts of coal and fossil fuel.
Right. The factories, the high-speed rail, the new mega cities, all of that was built on a foundation of carbon.
But then we look at slide 13, and it introduces a metric that seems to completely contradict the emissions data.
Energy intensity.
Yeah. While absolute per capita emissions are up at 9.3 tons, a metric called energy intensity has plummeted from 10.91 down to 6.33.
It is not a contradiction, though. It is a vital nuance of how economies transition.
Then I really need you to walk me through the math here, because on the surface, it sounds like a PR spin. How can a country be emitting wildly more carbon per person, but you're telling me things are actually getting more energy efficient? How does total emission go up while intensity drops? Let's define energy intensity first. Energy intensity measures the amount of raw energy required to produce a single unit of GDP. Essentially, how much coal do you have to burn to make $1 of wealth?
Okay.
Historically, when the economy was relying on heavy, low-end manufacturing, like smelting crude steel or making cheap plastics, creating $1 of economic value required massive amounts of dirty energy. That's why the intensity was at 10.91.
It was a brute force, highly inefficient economy.
Exactly. But a drop from 10.91 to 6.33 means the economy is bleeding far less energy per dollar made. This is a phenomenon economists call decoupling.
Decoupling the economic growth from the energy consumption.
Yes. Total energy use is still massive, hence the 9.3 tons of CO2, because the sheer size of the economy is now gargantuan. But the rate at which they use energy to generate wealth has become vastly more efficient. And why is that? because of the shift we talked about in slide 14.
Oh, the shift to services and high tech.
Yeah.
Because a dollar made from a software subscription or a financial transaction or a high-tech EV battery takes way less raw energy to produce than a dollar made from smelting iron.
Precisely. They're moving up the value chain.
Yeah.
And this dynamic is perfectly described by a well-known economic theory called the environmental Kuznets curve.
The Kuznets curve. I've heard of this. It's an inverted U shape, right?
Correct. The theory suggests that as a poor agrarian country begins to industrialize, pollution worsens dramatically. Environmental regulations are ignored or non-existent in favor of raw economic growth and poverty alleviation. The environment is sacrificed to build the industrial base. That is the upward slope of the U.
Which explains the historical smog, the polluted rivers, the surging CO2.
But eventually, the country hits a turning point at the top of the curve. The society gets wealthy enough that its citizens' priorities shift. When you are starving, you don't care about air quality, you care about a paycheck. But when you have a middle-class income, a nice apartment, and a tertiary educated child, you suddenly care very deeply if the air outside is too toxic for your child to breathe.
The political economy shifts. The citizens demand clean air, and the government, which now has massive financial resources, can actually afford to invest heavily in green technology.
Exactly. So pollution peaks and then begins to decline on the downward slope of the U, even as the economy continues to grow.
Yeah.
The state begins heavily subsidizing renewable energy. They become the dominant global players in solar panel manufacturing, wind turbine deployment, and electric vehicle production. They enforce strict emission standards on factories and phase out the dirtiest coal plants.
So the drop in energy intensity from 10.91 to 6.33 is the empirical proof that they have crested the Kuznets curve and are on their way down.
Yes.
It marks a painful, expensive, but absolutely necessary pivot toward high-value, lower-emission industries. Because if they didn't decouple, an economy of that scale would literally choke on its own exhaust.
It is the only way a mature economy of that size can continue to grow without collapsing its own environmental ecosystem. The green transition is not just an environmental goal for them, it is a hard economic imperative.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, analyzing decades of data. I want to try and synthesize all of this. Let's look at the final slide, slide 15, which serves as the conclusion of the presentation. It brings all these multidimensional data points together into a single narrative.
The slide uses a matrix, summarizing the four main forces we discussed. First, the demographic structure, where the working-age population peak forces the end of the cheap labor era. Second, the human capital explosion, where mass tertiary education provides the talent to replace the lost labor.
Right.
Third, the digital infrastructure, which creates an internal service-based economy. And fourth, the green transition, where dropping energy intensity points toward a sustainable future.
When you look at the raw data across all these sectors simultaneously, it proves an irreversible structural metamorphosis. We've traced the path from raw population scale to highly educated talent.
We've watched the transformation from heavy, brute force capital investment funded by immense domestic savings into nimble, digital agility. And we've seen the painful but verifiable shift from high-pollution industrialization toward energy efficiency and green technology.
The speed and scale of this transformation are what make it historically unique. It shows us the blueprint of how a modern economy is actually built, not over the span of centuries as we saw in the West, but compressed into a single human lifetime.
And why should you, the listener, care about this deep dive into decades of data? Why does a 50% savings rate or an infant mortality drop matter to your life?
That's the big question.
Because understanding the mechanics of these numbers gives you the ultimate lens to decode the global economy today. When you read news about global supply chain shifts or international climate change negotiations or the fierce geopolitical competition over advanced technologies like semiconductors and green energy, you aren't just reading isolated headlines. You're seeing the results of the data.
You are seeing the direct ripple effects of the exact data we just unpacked. The economy we explored today is too massive to exist in a vacuum. Its structural shifts alter the gravity of the entire global market. This isn't just about one country's history. It is the ultimate case study in rapid macroeconomic evolution.
It teaches us how capital, labor, and technology interact under extreme pressure.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Think back to that demographic dilemma we talked about at the very beginning, the collapsing working age population and the surging old age dependency ratio. We saw the data perfectly map how human capital, higher education, and advanced physical infrastructure replaced raw physical labor over the last 60 years.
The shift from the demographic dividend to the talent dividend.
Exactly. But what happens in the next 20 years? We are watching the explosive global rise of artificial intelligence at the exact same moment that this hyper-educated workforce is rapidly aging and shrinking.
Oh, that's fascinating.
If the last transition was substituting capital for labor, what is the next transition? Will artificial intelligence become the ultimate digital demographic dividend?
That is the defining economic question of our time.
Think about it. When you don't have enough young people to fill the entry-level jobs or even the mid-level engineering jobs, will lines of code and neural networks step in to replace the millions of human workers who are retiring today? Will AI act as an invisible, tireless workforce that requires no pensions and no health care, perfectly counterbalancing that 21.15% dependency ratio?
And if so, what does the next set of multi-dimensional data look like 50 years from now?
It will be a completely unprecedented chapter in economic history, something to mull over until next time. Keep diving deep.